So, and here's the problem. Singling out the actual real-world explanation from a set of potential explanation delivered by various analytical connections based on various robust models. And now this is a sentence that's not there. I added it here. Assuming that the actual explanation is among them. All right. So imagine again the racial segregation case. I showed you that Schelling model does the job, produces segregation. But also, strong racial preferences produce segregation. Also, apartheid laws produce strong segregation. Also, these economic factors, right, housing prices, income differences, produce segregation. So the point is, if you go to a city, you go to Boston and say, what's going on here? Oh, say you go in 1970, you go to a city somewhere, right, and say, look, they have racial segregation. Explain that to me. Then you say, well, there are many possibilities, right? I don't know whether there are segregation laws and blah, 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 blah. So, oh, okay, and you want to explain it, then you must make up your mind. So this is the problem, singling out the actual real-world explanation from a set of potential explanations. And the potential explanations you get by the various models that you've calculated. And I think there it's quite clear, this can only be done by eliminating all but one possible explanation. So you have the full menu of possible explanations, and you can only get to the real explanation if it's among them, if you somehow single out that one and discard the others. That's the only way, yeah. Yeah, wait a minute. Yes, very good question. Very good question. When it's overdetermined, then it's getting really tricky and nasty, and I don't have an answer for that. But absolutely right. So, for instance, we start already with that. A potential explanation with empirically true premises is not necessarily the actual explanation. That is also, I did not find that in the literature, and I'm surprised because that is, in a sense, obvious. So you have these potential explanations, and then you see that the premises really apply in the real world. Then most people would say, yeah, that's the explanation, right? Because it's empirically correct. So, example. You have a city and you have measured weak racial preferences and racial segregation. So, empirically, most of these people are really slight racial, well, it may be, it sounds so negative as the examples I gave you last time was also that you have a slight preference for something, right? Meaning that, say, you sit in this conference and then you go for the first time, you have lunch, and then you don't know anyone, and the others also, and then there are already tables, and there's one table with 4 males sitting there and 4 women sitting there, and you are a woman, and then you say, well, I want to sit. You don't hate men, but you say, I feel a little more comfortable with the other women. And many men also, they say, oops, all these women, I'm afraid I'd rather sit with a man. This doesn't mean you hate men or women. You just have a slight preference, you feel slightly more comfortable, right? So it's very weak, but already there you observe that, or surfers and swimmers and so on, all these examples. So it sounds so ugly, but it's just a slight preference. You just feel a little more comfortable without hating the others, but that's enough for the decision you make, right? And then you choose this table, and then you look at the whole table, and then the men sit all together, and so on. Okay, so you have a city with weak racial preferences and racial segregation. So the next step would be, the naive step would be, oh, I can explain it, right? Because I know from the models. Wait a minute, weak racial preferences would not be a good explanation if the city is under apartheid law or income differences. And this is your case, right? Because then, in a sense, the result is overdetermined, as one says in the philosophy. You have several determinants at the same time. And if you ask, give me the explanation, then the expectation is that you refer to one specific causal factor. And here are several causal factors which would do the job, right? For that question, I do not have a general answer. I would think that if you say, go to Cape Town in 1970, right? And then you see, oh, segregation. And then someone tells you, all these people have slight racial preferences. Say, oh, interesting, yeah. But then someone tells you, oh, and in addition, by the way, we have apartheid laws. The blacks are not allowed to live here and only whites. Then it's, oops, that's the much better explanation. So the point is that if you have this causal overdetermination, you have to somehow find out which is the leading cause, if something like that exists, right? I thought about it today in the morning, and I don't have a general solution to that. I think one must go then into the history of that city, for instance, if in that particular case. You got to ask, how did it come about? And then if you, for instance, then know the story that it was completely mixed, then came apartheid laws, bang, and then suddenly the blacks moved all to the east, and then you know exactly it was apartheid laws. And then you know, oh yeah, from that story, it's probably that's of course the apartheid laws, and it's not the weak racial preferences. But you may have a different story, that it was somehow a mixed city, or it was nothing, and then both blacks and whites moved in, and the prices were all the same for all of them, and then you get it, and then you say, okay, under these circumstances, it's probably weak racial preferences is the factor, right? And then even if later perhaps segregation laws came in, then you may say the result of this racial separation there, given the history, is more likely already because people lived there already, and then later came the laws, to a few blacks to get them out of the white neighborhoods, and then you say yes, but that doesn't explain the racial segregation across the whole city, right? So therefore, for that, I don't have a general answer. That's not so. This goes further. So I don't have a general answer for that. But that shows you that the problem, even if you have a set, or once you have a set of potential explanation, that then the problem isn't solved. It really starts in some sense, and it becomes really serious. And has nothing to do with credibility of models. Right? All these models are completely credible. So I think if you look at Sugden's paper then, where he speaks about credible worlds, that is fundamentally wrong. It's not about credibility, because all these models, for instance, say in the racial segregation case, I read an article regarding for the Schelling of referring to the Schelling model, in which a sociologist said, I mean, this is ridiculous for sociologists to refer there to racial preferences. Of course, I would immediately look at the economic conditions, right? And as economists, probably also economists would say, wait a minute, what do houses cost? What's the income differences? And that for an economist, economists wouldn't feel racial. Yeah, sure. But of course, you look at the economic factors as first ones, and then it's because you know that so many things can be explained. If you look at the demography, but just by the prices and the incomes, it's so obvious. So as an economist, you would first ask, okay, wait a minute. So for instance, if you looked at the better regions in cities on the northern hemisphere are typically in the west, because the west wind, the west wind comes from the west, yes. So at the west wind that comes first reaches the western regions, then goes over the city, there's all the bad air, and then at the east, of course, the air is worse. And therefore, the west parts of the cities are typically in cities on the northern hemisphere where the ground is more expensive, because people prefer to live there. And of course, if you have certain phenomena like that, I mean, as an economist, you look at those things, what are the economic relevant factors, because they are important. I mean, of course, there can also be factors like religion, blah, 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 and there's a traditional church there, and then people live there. But also you would look, so there are many possible factors. Anyway, so the point is that the difficulty arises where you put your fingers rightly on if we have several potential explanations, and then you can empirically verify that they apply. And then comes a story that is untold, at least from me. I don't know. In abstract, what you have to do, one way is possibly looking at the history. I don't know it, but that's additional or consequential problems. I can't solve everything at the same time, if I can solve it at all. Okay, so the promotion of a potential explanation to actual explanation is not alone due to its intrinsic properties, right? You can't you have a potential explanation delivered by your models, and then it's impossible to raise its status to actual explanation by looking at its intrinsic properties, only looking at that. For instance, is the explanans, the thing that does the explanation, is it empirically true? For instance, are there racial preferences, right? Weak ones, or the credibility. This is all not enough because you have alternatives, but you must eliminate all alternative potential explanations. There is no way. So this is why I think that Sugden is, in a sense, there, and you know, I'm really hesitant saying something like that because he's a good economist, no doubt, and I'm no economist, but I think there Sugden is fundamentally wrong, because just by talking about credibility of a model, he talks about an intrinsic property of that model. And that's not the issue. Many models may be credible in that sense and plausible and say, yes, that would explain it, but the point is there are alternatives and you've got to eliminate the alternatives. So the real explanation is only an explanation due to the elimination of the others. That seems to me absolutely cogent. In the same way that the talk of the empirical confirmation of a model is often incomplete or misleading, because it's not the decisive point that your model is empirically confirmed, because it could be that an alternative explanation is also empirically confirmed. So for instance, if you have empirical confirmation for, that's a trivial case, of strong racial preferences, of course that implies weak racial preferences. Sure, yeah, trivial. So, but the other way around, of course, doesn't hold. So empirical confirmation doesn't do the full job. What you need is then empirical or whatever sort of disconfirmation of the alternatives. Otherwise, you can never exclude the alternatives. And that seems to me a problem that is, I don't know whether there's a general solution for that, but I know the answer must be that you've got to eliminate the alternatives. Otherwise, you can't be sure that you are at the right explanation. The adequate explanation by a model consists then of the empirical adequacy of the model, right? Say racial segregation, and then you say, okay, what are these people? Are there income differences and racial preferences, strong ones, apartheid laws, blah, blah, blah. So you must know what is empirically adequate. Of course, if there's no apartheid laws, of course, you can't explain anything by apartheid laws because they are not there. Okay, so it must be empirically adequate, but also the elimination of all other, also potentially explanatory models. This is absolutely necessary, I think. And of course, all others, that's not possible, but you know, then you all the candidates, they come to your mind and say, yeah, that doesn't work. It's not an explanation by the effects of angels, for instance. Angels, they don't do the job in American cities, right? Here's the summary of the logic of explanations by models. So we have a model world final state, and that is abstractly identical with a real world state, namely a state, Schelling model, of racial segregation. And the term racial segregation has a meaning in the model world, right? And it has a meaning in the real world, right? You can define it, well, 90% of it, whatever you do it, okay. So you have a model world final state. And then you come with a model. You investigate the model and what you want to do with the model such that the dynamics of the model is such that it develops into the model world final state. Right? This is what the Schelling model does. You start with some initial condition, and then the weak racial dynamics. Then the model develops into the model world final state. That's okay. And then you do robustness analysis. Okay, you can do that for one initial state first, and then you do robustness analysis, meaning you play around with all the parameters, all the initial conditions, all the other parameters. You play around with them. You do robustness analysis, and the robustness analysis may be successful or unsuccessful. Right? In case it is unsuccessful, so if the model is not robust against certain inessentially or presumed inessentially parameters, you say the model isn't worth anything, I can't do anything with it. So you must continue only with those models that are robust. Therefore, you do robustness analysis. So once you have robust plus here, robustness analysis is positive, and then together with the model, what you get is inductive support for an analytic connection. So this is the core element of what I'm saying. You get inductive support for an analytic connection. This is what you get by the model. The analytic connection in the Schelling model is, of course, weak racial preferences necessarily lead to racial segregation. This analytic connection can be directly applied first to the potential and leading to potential real-world explanations. Right? to potential real-world explanation because it's analytic, right? You gained it or you supported it in the model world, but because it's analytic, you can directly apply it to the real world. Now, the point is then you get one potential real-world explanation by one model. And because this is not enough, there are other models, so you do the same with more models, right? And all the models that you discuss are those models that has final state, the model world final state, abstractly identical with real world state. So you have additional models. Then also with the other models, you do robustness analysis. And those models that survive, you get also analytic connections, right? The analytic connections, once you have apartheid laws and they are enforced, you get segregation. Once you have strong racial preferences, you get segregation. Once you have income differences and house pricing differences, you get segregation. It's analytic connections. You don't have to prove them. In reality, it's analytic, right? This is what these things do. And then you get three direct, in that case, you get a set of potential real-world explanations, right? They are all potential explanations. And then you got to show that some of them are not valid for empirical reasons or whatever reasons. So you can eliminate some of them. Okay, and one survives, only one is left, and this is then the actual real-world explanation. So that's the story, and of course the complications about these multiple possible explanations where you did there, for that I don't have a general answer. I don't have it. But this is the general scheme, how it works, and the fundamental element is of course this analytical connection, and that makes the whole difference to the discussion before. It is, by the way, I haven't checked that yet, very similar to what Sugden said was impossible. That was the exploration of concepts, where he said, well, Sugden says, no, that doesn't work. It was number 3 or 4, and he dismisses it. Anyway, I come to the conclusion, contrary to Sugden, the most problematic aspect of explanation of real phenomena by abstract models is that models only deliver potential explanation. That's the weak point, right, of models. It's not the transfer. A potential explanation can only be transformed into the actual explanation by elimination of all other potential explanations. The actual explanatoriness of a model is thus not just the property of the model itself. For instance, its credibility. This is really the wrong move, to think you've got to see it in the model whether it's credible or not. No, it's not. Models must be robust in order to inductively support non-obvious, more or less general analytic connections. And this is the story. And think about it, and if you want to discuss it, we can discuss it. As I said, this is not common wisdom. This is just my story, which has not been properly tested. But I wanted to propose it to you and wish you a wonderful week.